Hey everybody, and welcome back. Kevin here, and in this video we'll be saving our custom post type of seat and its custom fields, row and letter, to a custom database table. TypeRocket by default will save our custom fields to the WP post meta table, and that's quite nice in terms of plugin integration, so other plugins can work with it because plugins know that the post meta table exists. And then also WordPress works very well against the post meta. And if we are to transition to a custom database table for our custom fields, we're going to lose some features. However, what we gain is really nice when we move to a custom database table. And a few of those things are performance. So when we query the database, we don't have to do a lot of crazy joins to do more complex queries. Custom database tables also help us organize our information a little bit better, and it gives us a much easier view into what's going on. So there are many other benefits to using custom database tables for our custom fields on a post type, but essentially you'll have to pick and choose which one's right for your situation. So to kick things off, the first thing that we need to do is to create that custom database table for our custom fields that will be saved against our seat post type here. So we're going to use Galaxy, and we'll use the flight CLI command because we're working within our plugin here that we have. So under WordPress plugins flights, we started this flights plugin, and we'll need to use this. So I'm going to switch to favorites because it's a little bit more compact. And we need to make a migration. And the migration that we're going to create will be for a table named PT seat data. And I like to prefix things with add and at the end table if I'm using that migration to create a table. So we'll just run this command, and then it will create a migration in our migrations folder here. Now, by default, that will be empty, and you'll need to fill it up with the custom database creation script that you want to run in SQL. So here I already have that filled out, and essentially we're going to create this table, PT_seat data, and then it's going to contain an ID field that auto increments as the primary key for this database table, as well as a seat ID. And this is essentially our post ID, just with a different name. So I'm going to do this to help the brains connect the dots here. So this post ID relates back to the post table over here, and it connects to that ID. And so we want the post ID of the item that we create to match the post ID here. And this is very similar to how post meta works, where we have post ID, and that's how it connects the data back to that post record. And then we can connect these custom fields over to our post. Okay, so that is how we have this set up. And then we can have as many of these other columns as we'd like for the number of custom fields that we have. And then that's going to give us much better control and brevity in terms of how we query the database for our custom post type fields. So with all of this in place, I'm going to delete this one that we just created and delete that. And then because this already exists, I can just run the migration. So I will do migrate up, and that will add our custom database table. Refresh here. And here we have our custom table with information and columns that we need. Now, this database table is obviously blank, and we need to start saving data to the database table. So let me clean things up here a little bit and close out some of these menus. So this gets us into essentially creating the model for that new custom database table. And to do that, we'll go to the terminal and run our command again for Galaxy. So PHP Galaxy flight make model. And this is a base model because it's for a custom field. And then we'll say this will be seat data will be the name of the model. We'll run this, close the terminal, and jump over to this model. And then we need to name the resource to the name that we had for the database, which was PT seat data. And then this will connect the model to that database table, and then we can use this model to start saving data into that database. However, before we do that, we need to make sure that we connect the two models together, the seat data and the seat model. And to do this, we just need to call on what we learned in a previous video for creating relationships. So return, and then we'll return a relationship called belongs to, and then it belongs to the seat model. And it connects through that seat ID that we saw earlier. So seat ID. And just make sure our database is correct. I actually called it post ID. So I need to rename this because I messed up the migration. Factor. I'm sure I freaked out many people when I did that, but we're fixed up here. Okay, so now let's relate this seat data back to this model of seat. So this time we're going to do this and then data, and we will return this, and then we want a has one relationship to the seat data, and we will connect to that seat ID column. And then this will be how we essentially connect the seat data and the seat models together. And this has one is a new type of relationship connector method on our model, and it simply means that when we're looking for seat data, instead of using the ID column from this WP posts field, we actually want to use the ID column on the seat data. So let's save this out, and then our connections are in place, and we're ready to start saving the information to the database. To do that, we need to essentially go into our seat controller and then make sure that when this seat is saved on our admin side, that data is captured and then put into the database. So we can do this with a feature in TypeRocket called onAction, and then onAction that we care about is save. It will return essentially a type, and that type will be either create or update, and then it will return a model. And the model will be the model that corresponds to this particular controller, which is our seat. So I want to get the seat, and then we're also going to need some other information to save seat data, right? So first we're going to need seat data itself. So we're going to import that as data. And then we're also going to need the request for the page to get the fields. So the TypeRocket HTTP namespace here, a request. And then it's going to be cache request. And this should get us what we need in order to start saving data to this database table. So I'm going to kind of shrink some of this stuff in here. All right. Let's start saving our seat data. So I will get the data variable, which is our seat data. And then to save out, we first need to check if a seat data record already exists that is connected to the seat that was just submitted, per se, by this controller. So we need to look it up by that seat ID to ensure that no record already exists. But if one does exist, then we need to make sure we get that record and use that to save these custom fields against. Again, this is because we have a one-to-one relationship in our database between these two models, the seat and the seat data. And so we want to make sure that that is the case. So we'll have seat data here. And essentially, we will see if that seat data exists. And I'm going to pull this out into an ID so we can easily see where this ID is being used. Okay, so we have the first record of seat data. If it exists, then we want to take that seat data object here, that's the return model of seat data, and we want to save our custom fields that get submitted by our form in here. So request fields, and that will do it for us. So then if we jump to the browser, when this form is submitted with row and letter, an array with row and letter will be submitted, and then that will be captured by the save method, and then that information will get saved into the row and letter corresponding columns within our custom table. Okay, So with this in place, the last thing to do is to handle the exception. So if a record is not found, then we need to create a new record for seat data to be saved as. So else, and then we need to grab data. And this data variable is just an empty object or empty model without anything in it. All we did here was use it to query a new model, but it's still empty. So there are no values assigned to that model. So we can reuse it. It will be like a fresh copy of our seat data model. And we want to assign the seat ID, and this will manually set the custom field for the seat data. So if I jump back to the database here, we're setting the seat data value for the record that we're interested in to the ID that we just got from the saved post type. And in the browser, that post type ID is 12. So we'll be saving ID of 12 into the seat, and then we just need row and letter from here. And we're going to manually set these two fields. We can do it through request. I'll paste it in here. And then we can grab the actual field itself instead of the array of fields by passing a key to the fields themselves. From here, all we have to do is do data, save, and that works just great. Now, if you're a little bit confused about what happened here, is when we call on action save, we're going to get a fresh copy of seat data. And this fresh copy is essentially the same as doing new seat data. And that creates a new model for us. And then we start filling up this model with custom fields. And I need to set these to letter and row. And now it's going to fill out those three rows, seat, row, and letter, seat, row, and letter here. And then ID is auto incrementing, so we don't have to set ID. That'll be handled for us, and then we save it. So this line here is equivalent to what this does. And we're able to reuse it from this search because we're not actually accessing search when we pull out this variable SD. This is essentially being used just for the query engine behind that model. So we don't actually have to do this line of code here. So with this in place, when we save our custom field on the browser side, everything will be saved for us. And if we jump back over to the browser, we'll change this to C, update, and that works great. However, these custom fields are not actually connected to the custom data we just saved. So let's jump to the code here and look at our custom fields that are being saved. So we have 15C, but what's really happening is that for our seat of ID 12 here, if I do post ID equals 12, we'll see that the meta is also updating. And that's because we have not yet told TypeRocket not to automatically save these custom fields to meta. And so we need to make sure that we go in here to our seat model and update this with some settings that's going to tell WordPress don't save these custom fields as post meta. So here we go. We're going to do protected and then the custom property to tell it which fields are meta-less, essentially. We're not going to save it to meta, is this meta-less setting. And so we will say that is row and letter. And now these custom fields will no longer be saved to seat meta or post meta. So I can delete these two rows and we'll submit that to the database. So that is gone. And then if we jump back to the browser and update, we'll see that it's row 1. But if we save, it'll keep defaulting to A1 or 1A because these fields are not looking up the data from the custom database table. They're still looking up the post meta. So what we need to do at this point is tell those custom fields, hey, stop looking inside of our post meta for this custom field data. We need you to look into the seat data part of our model. And so what we do here is we need to remember that on the seat model, in order to get to data from another related model, we have to hit this data method That way we can reach into that model and grab the custom fields, the ones that we're interested in our row and letter, and that will let us get the values that we care about. So over here on our post type, we are using the seat model, and we are injecting the seat model whenever we save title as. And here, when we save title as, we'll see that the seat is reaching into meta, and we want it to reach into data. And so we'll do that here. And now when we save our custom field, the title will be updated. However, these custom fields still are not looking for the data information. They're looking by default into post type meta. And so in order to tell it to jump into the data, we can set the group on our field here. So set group to data. And this essentially will cause it to look into data first. And then once it looks into data, which was, as we saw here, this relationship, then we'll be able to look into row on that relationship and get row from this custom database table. So we can put the group here, or we can use a little shorthand. And the shorthand that I like to use is just to put the group in front of the name, and then that will handle all of the lookup for us. And if our data was deeply nested, then we could do continuous dots. So if we had other relationships on this, we could say look to data, go to seat, go back to data, and we can do like a little loop to get back to row here. So data would look at the seat data, and then that would look at seat because we said seat, and it would go back to data again and then into row. And if that confused you, excellent, I did my work. But ultimately, what we need here is data to reach into row. Okay, and that's going to pull our custom field information out of here. And if I refresh this, it's 1F. And if we go back to the browser, we should refresh this page and see that it loads as 1F. And there we go. That custom field is connected. And if we look at our debug information, if we have debug mode turned on, we'll see that data.letter is being used. And if we dive into our specific HTML element, we'll also see here that the name is being grouped into this data bucket along with letter. However, before, this custom field was just letter. And so now when we submit our request to this page, I'm going to network, preserve log. We'll look at docs here. I'm going to submit this information. And if we look back at our post requests, we'll scroll down and we'll see our custom fields that are submitted here. TR, and we'll see that it's grouped into an array now. So this is a multi-dimensional array of data and row. And so what will happen is, before we were grabbing inside of our controller here, we're grabbing just row and letter. However, it would be something like data.row and data.letter, because when we submit this, we're going to have to reach into data first. Here, we'll reach into data and get row. So ultimately what we need to do is we need to grab just data, and instead of defining these specifically, we can just pass that in here and then make sure that we also look for data on the fields for our update mechanism, and then this will save those custom fields whenever we hit update. If we don't do this, then we won't get a save on the admin interface side. So to make sure this works, let's change it to D. Hit update, and now we'll see we do have D, and when we submitted that post, it submitted it as a part of this group. So our information is saving. We have 1D, and then if we jump back to the post of 12 here on all seats, we should see that 1D is present. However, we don't have a row and we don't have a letter here in these custom columns. And the reason for this is the same reason that we had the issue on these custom fields. We have to prefix it by a group. So we'll do it here. And then what we'll note here is we are sorting currently by row. So if I go back, we can sort this field because we're using custom post meta. However, with custom fields, we will not be able to sort. So it'll be disabled by default. And that's because this WordPress admin uses its own WP query system that is not aware of our custom table, and that's why we can't sort. Essentially, it's just how WordPress works, and we have to deal with it if we're going to use custom database tables for these custom fields. Now, we have this information in here and all this looks great. And the reason that all of this works really well is primarily because for our post type, we set the model. If we were to remove this model piece, then our system will not work. And that's because without this model being attached to the post type, then we won't have access to these relationships, particularly data. So we won't be able to reach into data unless our post type is told that it's connected to that model. So we have to connect our seat to our model explicitly. We did not do that in the last tutorial. This is sort of a catch up, and you may have run into errors because this line was not in here. And so just be aware that you're going to need to have that in place to get all of this working. Now, one of the things that we'll run into in our post meta, if I can go back to that, is that we're now saving this data field because we passed data into our meta. So we also need to say that data is metaless in our seat model. And we can do that here. And you may want to save custom fields when you group them like that to a custom table and to meta, so you have the best of both worlds. And if you do that, just keep in mind that your data could fall out of sync. That custom database table could be updated somewhere else. However, if you're very confident that you can synchronize those, and there's no reason you can't do it, just, understand that it's fairly risky. Okay, so let's go into our post meta, and we're going to delete this row here, submit that to the database, and then let's go make sure that when we submit this, we don't get that information saved. So I will refresh this table, and there is no data, so data is no longer being serialized and saved to the database. So that's a complete cleanup of our setup here. And that's essentially how you save custom fields into your custom post type into a custom database table. However, there is one little thing that I'd like to cover here, and that's cleaning up this bit of code. We can actually do everything here with just 2 lines of code. And the way that we do that is we can use a different type of query. So here we're using where. So we can actually do a different type of query on this data object, which is the seat data model. So we can do find where first or new with. And so what we want is actually this information here. And what this will do for us, and we can actually just say, take the seat ID here, put that in there, and then we'll just copy this for later, delete that and clean up. Okay, so let's talk about what happens here. So what happens is we try to find the first item, which is what we had before. We looked up by seat ID, and we tried to get the first one. So we're doing the exact same thing. However, what we're going to do next is say, hey, if we were not able to find that information, so we're going to find the first one, or we're going to create a new version of seat data, and we are going to include with that new instance the seat ID of the ID that we passed. So it's going to automatically set the seat ID for us. And then we can just save the request data, and this does everything that we had in the code previously. So we'll just save this, go back to the browser, change that to C, hit update, and it does the exact same thing. And if we go to an item without that data, we'll change it to 1F again, hit update, and then go back to all seats. We'll say that this remains 1F, but now we have those custom fields in here. And so that's a much cleaner way of handling the saving of data. So to recap, we've added a new method with just 3 lines of code here and a few imports. We've created a new model and synchronized it to our seat. Using this has-one relationship, we've made sure we have metaless information on that class, so we don't save that information, those custom fields, as meta any longer. On our seat post type, we made sure that we set the model, and then we also reached into the relationship for the column and the custom fields and for our save as method. So with that, we connected to all of that, with the post type seat data table, and that was it. That is how we were able to save the custom information to a custom field for our post type And now we can do some more interesting queries to get information out of our database instead of using that post meta. So now we have access to a more performant data structure for our custom fields. And that is it for this tutorial. Thanks for tuning in.